Nintendo. Do I even have to talk about how synonymous they are with video games? I mean, this is the company behind Mario, Donkey Kong, Zelda, among many others, some of the greatest all-time characters that are part of some of the most successful franchises. For many reasons, video games themselves would probably be something very different today without them, but I think we all know this already, so I'm here to highlight some of the parts of this company that are far less talked about. Like, here, I'll bet that when I say Nintendo goes back to the 1800s, that sentence doesn't even sound right. It sounds strange to me anyway, because I always think of the NES, or I guess the Famicom in Japan in the 1980s, as being the earliest product from Nintendo. I'm sure that I'm not alone there, but in reality, that console was sort of like the breakout hit for a company that had already been around for over 90 years. So I think it would be interesting to take a look back at those 90 years. It really is a unique story, so I'm going to highlight some of the more unexpected or more significant businesses that ultimately led to the famous Nintendo Entertainment System. Starting off with playing cards, and it's strange to think that even to this day, the majority of the company's existence has been centered around playing cards. And I should say right away that as an American, I apologize for some of these pronunciations, specifically when I say Fusajiro Yamauchi. He started the company in the former capital, Kyoto, Japan, with the intention of making and selling playing cards, which was actually more of an artistic endeavor than you might expect. I don't want to go too deep into the Japanese politics and legislation, but at the time, playing cards were a surprisingly touchy business. To my understanding, there were issues with gambling, specifically involving the Yakuza, the Japanese mafias, so there were these restrictions on imports as well as cards involving numbers and symbols. It gets a little weird, but it motivated him to produce these cards that went by the name Hanafuda. It's a word that translates to flower cards because they all have these beautiful nature-like photos on them. I mean, these were fancy decks of cards. 48 in total, broken down as 4 cards in each of the 12 suits meant to represent the months of the year. In the beginning, every one of them was hand-painted on bark that was taken from mulberry trees. After a while, the game itself became more popular. He started selling them in tobacco stores, and to meet the demand, he scaled the business by hiring more painters, opening more locations, and even manufacturing different types of cards. Almost exactly in the way that you would expect, and over the next few decades, they became the country's biggest maker of playing cards. They were mostly unaffected by wars or other economic changes because their product was cheap enough, especially compared to other forms of entertainment, and overall, it was a straightforward yet successful company. But in 1949, a 22-year-old named Hiroshi Yamauchi, again, I'm sorry, took over as the 3rd president of the company. He was the great-grandson of the founder, and amazingly, remained in charge all the way through the release of the GameCube. See, early on, he had a vision of expanding the company, but realized that they were only going to get so far by selling playing cards, so that's when they started looking in other directions. And to reflect that, in 1963, they changed their name from Nintendo Playing Card Company simply to Nintendo Company. Considering they had just become a public company on the stock market 1 year before that, they now had some money to invest toward new things. We all know where they ended up, but it was quite a journey to get there. So here we go, the weirdest time period for Nintendo. One of their first businesses outside of playing cards was instant rice. Just these packages of dehydrated rice that you would buy at the grocery store. It was inspired by the popularity of instant noodles, so I guess they figured that there would be a demand for instant rice, and maybe they could be the ones to fill it. Obviously, this was a product that didn't last very long. The word going around is that they weren't all that tasty, and I would guess that they were a little bit in over their heads when trying to compete with the existing food companies that knew a little bit more about what they were doing. Considering it was only available for a brief time in the 1960s in Japan, I think it's unlikely that anyone watching this has actually tried it, but if by some miracle you have, I would love to hear what you thought of it. Alright, my next one on the list is easily the most unexpected. Love hotels. I'm gonna keep everything family friendly here, but they are exactly what they sound like. Discreet hotel rooms sold by the hour, and for about 5 years in the 1960s, Nintendo owned many of them across Kyoto, Japan. There are quite a few rumors surrounding these, so if you want to learn more, I encourage you to look further into it. But for this video, I'm going to leave it at that and move on to their next business, which which was a taxi service. It was called Daya, and I don't have too much to say about this one either, considering they only owned them for less than a year. From my understanding, it was somewhat profitable, but then the drivers started unionizing, and Nintendo felt that the company wouldn't be profitable enough if their salary demands were met, so they quickly ended up selling it altogether. Another quick one that I wanted to mention is baby products. In the early 1970s, believe it or not, Nintendo was making stuff for babies, most notably a little seesaw-like toy called Twins, and a stroller called the Mama Bearica. I guess it was great technology at the time in that it was lightweight and foldable, but still not too impactful to the company overall. In fact, look at this list so far. Everything past playing cards was basically a failure, and oddly enough, I can see that as being somewhat comforting. If anyone is switching careers or trying to decide on a college major or something along those lines, just look at this. Arguably, the most successful video game company ever spent all that time completely directionless. Can you imagine? There was a time when they hoped people would associate the name Nintendo with rice. I consider these to be mostly wild attempts, just trying anything that looked like it had any kind of a chance. But after so many failures, things were looking bad, and well, here's where things start to make a little more sense. In 1964, Nintendo started making toys, a logical step from the playing cards. They were also making board games as well, so as I said, toys made a lot of sense. The very first one was the Rabbit roller coaster, just pretty basic. The little pieces would race down the track to the bottom, but the most significant toy for a number of reasons would be the Ultra Hand. It has a cool story. The president of the company was visiting one of the card factories where this guy, Gunpei Yokoi, was working there as a maintenance person. He had this side project that he was making in his spare time. When the president saw it, he loved it and had Yokoi further develop it for the market. That side project was this mechanical extending arm that you may have seen featured in future Nintendo games. They sold over 1 million of them at the perfect time for Nintendo. They were having trouble financially, and this was the product that kept things running at that time. While I'm talking about him, I should also mention that Yokoi was instrumental in numerous other projects for Nintendo, including, but not limited to, the creation of the Game Boy. But back to the Ultra Hand, it was followed by a couple of other successful products using the Ultra brand name, like this baseball game called Ultra Machine, and later on, the Ultra Scope. A couple of other toys worth mentioning would be the Love Tester. 2 people would hold these metal pieces, and then it'll give you your love score from 1 to 100, and the home bowling game. In the 1960s, bowling became really popular in Japan all of a sudden, and this was a great example of Nintendo taking advantage of that new trend. Speaking of bowling, and that's going to make sense in a second, the next one on my list would be arcade games. Do you see how we're finally getting closer to what we know them for? But it didn't start with video games necessarily. They took a weird path to get there. It depends on your definitions, but I would say that Nintendo's first attempt at this was in 1973 with the laser clay shooting system. Back to the bowling thing. At the time in Japan, bowling was pretty much a fad. It got really big in the 1960s, started falling off in the 1970s, and just got worse from there. Meaning by 1973, there were a bunch of unoccupied bowling alleys, and Nintendo saw that as an opportunity. They had this laser technology where if you shot a gun at a target, it would recognize whether or not you hit it. So Nintendo's big plan was to take out some loans and use that money to buy some old bowling alleys and essentially convert them into a laser shooting gallery. They would have all of this cool scenery on the wall, and then use a projector to display a bird or something that you would shoot at. It was a new and fun activity at the time. However, within the year, the big oil crisis happened, it hurt the economy, and all of a sudden, people were far less willing to spend money at a laser shooting gallery. But adapting to that situation is how Nintendo first got involved in arcades. They transformed that same technology and principle into a smaller, more affordable version of it that they called mini laser clay. They were arcade cabinets placed in arcades using that projector, so not technically video games, but still very much an arcade game. And that was followed by many other laser shooting games like Wild Gunman and Battle Shark. By 1978, video games were the next big thing. Space Invaders was one of the most popular things on the planet. Not released by Nintendo, I should make clear, but the popularity of it did motivate them to release many of their own games. The first one of these was Computer Othello, based on the board game, and many of those early ones were mostly knockoffs of other video games like Space Fever. But in 1981, they released the Donkey Kong arcade game, and in my opinion, since it included the characters of Donkey Kong and Mario, that's where the company really started taking shape. And that takes me to the last business of Nintendo and where they remain today, home consoles. Their first exposure to the market was in 1974, when Nintendo acquired the Japanese rights to distribute the first ever home console, the Magnavox Odyssey. But the first home system actually made by Nintendo was when they teamed up with Mitsubishi Electronics to make the Color TV game. It was 5 different releases only in Japan of dedicated consoles, starting in 1977. The first one being Color TV 6, because they played 6 variations of Pong. Well, they called it light tennis, but you know, it was Pong. It was followed by 4 others, one of which was more variations of Pong, and then a racing game, Breakout, and Computer Othello. I also want to mention that in 1980, they released the handheld Game & Watch, starting with the famous juggling game called Ball. And then, finally, what all of this has been building up to, the Famicom and the Nintendo Entertainment System, released in 1983 in Japan, 2 years later in the US, during a really bad time for video games. Of course, we had the video game crash of 1983 that caused a big sales drop across the industry, and I think we can say that the NES is what brought the country out of it. In short, the crash was brought on by all of these companies flooding the market with bad video games, and Nintendo was able to separate themselves from the others by simply making quality games and keeping their standards high. I realize that was a very brief overview, but we all realized that the NES was successful. By the end of the decade, Nintendo controlled 80% of the video game market, and from there, it's easy to see how the company morphed into what they are today. Let me know in the comments, were you surprised to hear that there was so much going on with Nintendo before most people even knew about them? Really, I'd like to know which parts you found to be the most shocking, and then which parts you thought made the most sense. Also, please keep in mind that this was a very specific video intended to cover the early evolution of Nintendo and the path of how they switched industries into video games, meaning the timeline stops right when things start getting big. So let me know if you'd be interested in a second video talking about what's been going on with them over the past few decades, and any other thoughts you have about Nintendo, leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.